welcome to Let's Talk Racism, a series of shows created by students from all over the globe. I'm Cora Parkinson.
And I'm Kudzai Chinamberry from Leeds in England.
I'm Yukta Wag with my co-host Pratiti Sinha.
And we are here from MIT School of Film and Television in India.
Fleur Havelaar.
And I'm Fatimata Diakabi from Breda University of Applied Sciences in the Netherlands.
I'm Maurice Santira, joined by
Clara Ip, and we're from Hong Kong Baptist University.
I'm Anna Ashite.
And I'm Shay Hayes. We're from Ryerson University in Toronto, Canada. The 10 of us are going to spend this episode of Let's Talk Racism sharing stories and interviews we produced.
And we're going to get personal. All of the stories in this episode of Let's Talk Racism are about individuals from around the world who are going to share their experiences of racism with us.
Let's get started. Our skin color is one visible aspect that sets it apart, and unfortunately, that alone can cause a cultural divide within society. Bahumi is a half Botswana, half Dutch girl who realized how her skin color made her stand out in the Netherlands.
Bahumi Mogwe Jansen was born in Botswana. She moved to the Netherlands when she was older.
The move made her instantly aware of the concept of Black identity and the weight of what that means in Dutch society. Let's take a look.
So a lot of people, when I moved to the Netherlands, they were like, wow, it's going to be so nice, you know, everything's so liberal, like their ideas of drugs, of gender, of, you know, just that sort of stereotypical idea of the Netherlands. But once you actually live there, you realize that's not really how it is. And there are all these layers of like microaggressions, but then hidden behind this liberal mindset.
This story basically showed me that every Black kid here in the Netherlands had the same childhood. We had to deal with the same type of microaggression, fears, and problems. And it kind of made me feel like, okay, I'm not alone in it, but it also made me realize like, wow, that means that every other kid here had the same kind of feeling I had in like high school, preschool, and that I don't know if I should be happy about that.
Yeah, while Toronto is a very diverse city, much like Fatimata, navigating through microaggressions and prejudice and inequality during my childhood into adulthood can certainly feel like you're the only one. So platforms and conversations like this really break the idea that systemic issues are not exclusive to individuals.
And just like you, Fatimata, I also faced many microaggressions and fears growing up as well. And just like Anna said, Toronto is very diverse. And although we do have our own problems of inequality, leaving the city, I feel like I stand out in certain ways.
We just heard of one woman's experience of being Black in the Netherlands. There are some countries where you might not expect to see anti-Black racism.
South Africa became a democracy in 1994, and since then there is an assumption that racism is no longer a major issue. But that's an illusion. In our next story from the University of Johannesburg, Sine Ngwenya and Tracy Ikopit remember experiences from their childhood.
I went to private schools for both primary school and high school, and one thing I noticed was definitely the different treatment with white people versus Black people. The white girls were always allowed to dye their hair, you know. One day they'd be blonde, the next day they'd have black hair, the next day they'd have red hair, you know. But the minute a Black girl got red braids, she had to take them out immediately because it didn't live up to school code, you know. And I remember my sister had her Afro puff, and they told her, no, make it smaller next time so that it's Nita, you know.
I just remember my experience in high school. So I'm from Fairhead, which is a small town in northern KZN, and in my high school, you know, we had asked the Black kids, then there was Afrikaans speakers, and then there was the German speakers. So that was quite a different experience or environment for me, because I did not think that white people would be racist against white people as well, and also to us towards the Black people as well. So, you know, you'd have the German kids. They were always with each other. They'd group together. They speak German within themselves, and they didn't really interact that much with the Afrikaans kids and the English speakers as well. So that for me was quite interesting to see, that even within them, you know, there's a bit of segregation as well. You'd also see it in the sports teams. I know for sure that in the first boys hockey team, most of it was dominated by the German speakers because they were that good, right? And we had one time in my grade 8 year, we had this one boy. He was a black boy and he was very good. And as black people, we seemed so proud to have that one boy in the team, and it felt like he was representing all of us. And I don't like that experience because we're like, oh, at least one of us is there. So
with regard to racism, I definitely think there has been progress because there are no longer laws, prohibiting interracial marriages. There are no longer pass laws and whatnot.
My thought is, especially now in modern South Africa, our generation tends to overlook these things or cast a blind eye, and they'll always keep bothering us unless we sit down and address them. And this is why I asked that question, is it possible to really end racism?
If we create a society where we are educating white people on the black experience, teaching them how to be better and exposing the new generation to this, then absolutely we can end racism.
Skin color can also play a huge role when people of color are profiled by the police or treated differently in public places because of their race.
That is exactly what happened to Nirvana. He is a 23-year-old man born in India who was moved to Canada. He would frequently fly alone at a young age and quickly began to realise that he was treated differently at airports due to the colour of his skin.
He spoke to our classmate Brittany Parsons from Ryerson about facing frequent discrimination during those times.
May I have your attention, please? This is to announce the arrival of Transatlantic Airlines Flight 700 from New York.
Hi, my name is Nirvana Fernandez and I'm from India. I was raised in Dubai for about 14 years, and then after that I went to boarding school in India until I was about 16, and then I came to Canada in grade 11 and I've been here ever since. Both my parents owned companies that required them to travel pretty much all over the world for work, so a lot of the time they would leave for work and have us meet them in different countries. So since I was about, I want to say 10 years old, 11 years old, I've been flying pretty much everywhere by my own or with my brother. So since I hit puberty when I was about 13 years old, I started noticing that I was treated differently at the airport and especially at security checkpoints. So whenever I went through a metal detector or ended up in immigration, I was always detained and kept longer, or I was randomly searched. I remember this one time when I was flying to Mexico and I was 16 years old. I was going to go visit my family. So I came to the airport, and that was something else. The security pulled me aside, they pulled me into a room and they accused me for being a drug mule. They put me in handcuffs and they continued to do a strip search, and then they even bent me over the table and did a cavity search, and there was nothing I could have done about it. And once it was over, I just, I'd tell my parents. Yeah, I told my parents. My parents were like, yeah, well, it is what it is. There's nothing you can really do about it. I was like, okay. Being 16 years old and experiencing all of that was, I don't know, mortifying, especially since, never ever done anything wrong. And the worst part is, every time security detains me, and they have a log, and they have a log about all this stuff around the world. Like, it's all linked through like one database, and it's linked to your passport number and who your global identity. Even after all of that stuff, and after having a cavity search and them being wrong, I never heard an apology from them, the services, nothing. My girlfriend, who's white, would probably just have to land at the airport, grab her baggage, walk up to the gate, and then walk out. Being brown definitely has its bad sides. Having dealt with it for the past like 8-9 years, I've reached a point where I'm no longer fazed by it. If I'm getting detained, I'm getting detained. I just know that the problem's not me, it's the system.
This is not an unusual occurrence. Another case in Canada involved Said Adam Ahmed, who was on the no-fly list as a baby for having the same name as a terrorist. It seems like common sense is completely thrown out the window during any situations of racism. Do you have a similar example from the UK, Kudzai?
Yeah, a friend of mine grew up in the same town as me, which is a predominantly white town, and he experienced racial profiling when he was being followed home by the police for no particular reason. And at such a young age, this can be very traumatic and make you feel like you already stand out. And it just shows that racial profiling is a big thing in the UK as well as Canada and everywhere else.
And what about the Netherlands, Fatimata and Fleur?
Well, people here in the Netherlands always tell me that I talk quite good Dutch for a Black person, which is weird because I've been living here my whole life. And what I also experience is that they would follow you around in particular stores just because to make sure that you're not stealing or anything. Or even at school sometimes when they ask me if I can talk Dutch because I look like an international, they assume that I'm an international student because of my looks.
Once my grandmother with her son, she was going to Dubai, and she was pulled out during the security checking and asked whether the bangles were taken from her from India or from Dubai. So she obviously replied that it was from India because she had it since marriage, and they asked her to either show the receipt of the golden bangles or break the green bangles which were in between, which is considered as a very bad omen in India. So that's what my grandmother had faced, and there are many more things which she has faced during the tour over there.
You know, just to quickly jump in, because Fatimata, as you mentioned, those experiences of being followed in the store or when you're in a space and they assume that you don't speak Dutch when you're born from there. Sometimes I experience people asking me, you know, where are you from? And you say, I'm Canadian. And then they're like, well, no, where are you actually from? Yeah, exactly. And so it's so strange that this goes on, and I'm really surprised to hear that it goes on in another country as well. I would have thought this is an exclusive experience.
We've been talking about racial profiling. It doesn't just occur as with our last story at the airport, but in everyday space like the hospital, or in this next case, the workplace.
So we're now joined by Cameron Foster, a student from CSU Fresno in California. Hi, Cameron.
Hi, everyone. My story is about an African-American man named Tracy Allen who was in a wealthy neighborhood in California, and he was faced with racial injustices while selling solar panels. He was harassed by a man, and the man called the police.
On my fourth day on the job, I went to this neighborhood in Clovis, and I knocked on my second door. And without giving away like all the super finite details, basically I knocked on the door. The wife was very endearing and kind, but a little bit short into my spiel. I want to say maybe like 10, 15 seconds into me just trying to introduce myself and tell them what I'm here for. The husband runs to the door, cuts me off, and basically yells all these kind of curse words at me and tells me to get away from his door, which is fine. I mean, it's not fine, but you know, a lot of salesmen experience that anyway. So I just said, okay, I'll just chalk that down as a guy that doesn't want to be bothered. And I left. I walked away. I said, have a nice day. All right, I'll leave you guys alone. Started walking to my next door. I look behind me and this man is glaring at me and even following me a little bit. And so I look back at him and raise my hands like this, just as if to ask, like, you know, what's going on? Is everything okay? He doesn't reply. So I just continue walking, knock on my next door, come back because nobody answered. And he's still just following me with his eyes through his whole neighborhood. I end up going to my fourth door And I come back out and I notice that he's on the phone. And I have my fiance in the car because she goes with me on these trips, and she just sits in the car while I knock on doors trying to sell. And she calls me and says, I think he's on the phone with the police. We should go right now because of everything that's happening, and I don't want anything to happen to you. Me, instantly that's fear kicking in for me, but there's also a form of anger and kind of confusion, like what is going on? Like I'm here, I'm dressed nice. I'm not dressed in a quote unquote mysterious way. Obviously I'm just here on the job doing business. Why is this man calling the police on me?
Do you see a difference between racial profiling and discrimination, or do you feel that they're the same thing?
Honestly, I feel like they can be one and the same. I don't feel like those two things need to necessarily be separated. I feel like racism is racism, and if you're racially profiling somebody just because they're a Black person in a nice neighborhood and you think that they don't belong here, that's racist. If you're discriminating against somebody and you just don't like them or whatever just because of their skin color, then nonetheless, like that's racist.
I also had a similar experience like Tracy Allen. I was in a wealthy neighborhood in California where I was shooting a project for my class, and I had so many of the neighbors come out and just check and see if I was in the right neighborhood. But luckily I was wearing my Fresno State shirt that has a logo of my school to show that I was just doing a project, which is sad that I have to do that, but yeah.
It's very sad, Cameron, and I'm so sorry that you've had that experience. A similar story that stood out to me, American story, was the story of Ahmaud Arbery, who was a 25-year-old young Black man who was murdered just while jogging in Georgia. Those within the neighborhood targeted him based on prejudice, assuming he was a burglar. And he wasn't, I guess, fortunate to be wearing something that identified himself as a person who deserved to be there, which is unfortunate. Everybody has the right to be able to jog. And it's just so difficult to think about your story and his story when we're the same age. I'm 25 as well. And so it's just very disheartening.
Yeah, it's so hard to hear those stories. And I know people within my own community who were targeted by police and repeatedly questioned for absolutely no reason.
Yeah, I know mainly a lot of young Black men I know, they always feel very cautious around police, and even what they wear, like hoodies up, they don't like to do that around them because they can get stereotyped. And it reminds me of when I was speaking to a young man named Tariq, who I interviewed in show 1, and he was stopped by the police in a wealthy white neighborhood in London just because they wanted to make sure his car was not stolen. Even though they checked his reg plate and they saw it was him, they still had to question why he was in this wealthy area, and it's just really disheartening.
I recognize this story as well. A son of a colleague of my mother was driving a Mercedes, which is a pretty expensive car, and he was just stopped because he was driving an expensive car, and he was checked for drugs just because he was a young Black man in a nice car.
It's so sad that all of us that are different skin color have to go through something like that. And at times I always have to let everyone know and smile that because I am a tall, big African-American man, to show that I'm not aggressive, but at the end of the day, I still get racially profiled and treated differently. And I'm sorry that everyone else is going through this.
Well, thanks for joining us for this part of the show, Cameron. We'll see you again at the end of this episode.
You're watching Let's Talk Racism, a show created by students from all around the world.
This is one of 5 shows we've produced to examine issues related to systemic racism in all our countries.
You can watch all our videos on Facebook and YouTube.
And all of our interviews and stories are on our website.
So far, we've been talking about being racially profiled at airport security in Canada, and being harassed for being a Black person in a wealthy neighborhood in America, and being stigmatized for your skin color in Dutch society.
Now let's see Estelle. She is a young Black woman living in the Netherlands who uses her social media platforms to protest against racism and to advocate for Black Lives Matter movement.
In the climate of BLM and the aftermath of George Floyd's killing by police in the United States, Estelle uses her voice to express the injustices that Black people face on a daily basis.
When she was 2 years old, Estelle moved to the Netherlands from Africa as a refugee and attended white schools. She followed Dutch culture and its traditions, but found one of those traditions troubling.
My name is Estelle Duimana. I'm a 21-year-old social innovation student here in Breda. I actually live here now, but I grew up in Leiden. I was born in South Africa, Johannesburg, and my parents are from Burundi. So that means my parents came here as refugees. And this is something that also very much influenced my perspective on racism, because my parents raised me to be thankful for having opportunity of having a new and bright future here in the Netherlands, because that was what was offered me. And I think therefore I was never that vocal about racism, because I had the feeling I was being very much ungrateful. Growing up in the Netherlands is like I had to be the whitest version of Black me. It was in somewhat ways actually traumatizing, because the generation where I grew up in, it wasn't cool to be different, and it was most definitely not cool to be Black. My first experience with racism was when I was in my last year of primary school. I was in a mainly white school. There was one other girl with a non-Western migration background in my class. And one day the teacher was very much fed up with us, and he decided to tell us, immigrants ruin everything and you ruin the school. And that was the first time I encountered racism. It's okay to be Black, it's even something to be proud of, you know. So every year around November, the Zwarte Piet discussion comes back up again. Growing up in the Netherlands, I always felt very much pressured to actually be pro Zwarte Piet. They pressure you in all different kind of ways. It's almost like brainwashing, you know. You have like the Sinterklaasjournaal, you watch that in school with your peers. They put social pressure by like white people like it, so you as an immigrant, you have to like it in order to fit in. The older I got, I met more people who were more aware about Black issues, you know, and they made me aware about the fact that I can be vocal about my issues, and it's okay not to be okay with things going on. So in June 2020, the Black Lives Matter movement found its way into the Netherlands. I went to the one in Amsterdam and I spoke in the one at the one in Breda. I think it was a quite tough pill to swallow for Dutch people, mostly because a lot of people weren't aware of the racism, which is very much integrated in our like society. An example of that could be Zwarte Piet, for example. What I see is that after the Black Lives Matter movement started here in the Netherlands, municipalities and people, they became aware. They started to think about the actions and the things they do. And what you see is that several municipalities and also big institutions, you know, they decided to be against Zwarte Piet, and they decided to either have a Zwarte Piet free holiday, or they decided to change the narrative of the story.
You heard Estelle talk about Black Piet. Have any of you heard of that Dutch tradition?
I haven't heard about it before.
Here's a quick explanation, and let's talk after that.
Sinterklaas is an annual Dutch children's celebration based on the legend of Saint Nicholas. The story dates back to the 13th century and has a rich evolving history. Today, kids are told that in November, Sinterklaas arrives from Spain on a steamboat with his servants, the Black Piets. In the past, the Black Piets were responsible for taking the naughty kids in a sack back to Spain to discipline them. Today's Piets are friendlier and more comical. Kids are told that the Piets are black because they slide down chimneys at night to bring them gifts. While this will make complete sense to a child, the big black afro, golden hoop earrings, and exaggerated red lipstick are a lot harder to explain. The general perception of the Netherlands as a progressive and diverse country often makes foreigners wonder, does this shameless national use of blackface still exist today? Well, the reality is that even last year during parades and performances, the Piets are almost always white people in blackface. The inferior position of the Black Piet to the white Sinterklaas further highlights the century-old connotations of slavery, racism, and discrimination. Black Piet has over the years gained global exposure and caused controversy and outrage both internationally and within the Netherlands. growing pressure of projects like Black Pete is Racism and Black Lives Matter have led to a national decrease in the full blackface costume. Arguments against these groups protest that Black Pete is a treasured Dutch tradition and urge others not to ruin the magic of the celebration for the children. Even today, this character continues to divide the Dutch society.
So when I was younger and I first experienced this whole Sinterklaas festivities, I remember the first time we were like in this gym hall and all the kids were there from the whole school, and all of a sudden there were this like the Black Pete's, basically they were like running around us and throwing candy, and at the first hand I got scared because I was like, what is going on here and why is everyone cheering? Because I felt like, I don't know, it was just weird to me. And yeah, I just always thought like something about this whole thing is not okay. So what do you guys think when you see that we celebrate these kinds of festivities here in the Netherlands?
Yeah, well, I actually didn't know about Black Pete until the video, and you and Flora shared your experience. Blackface in Canada actually dates back to Canadian history, from minstrel shows and theater skits.
Yeah, I also had no idea. And in recent history, our Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, participated in this deeply offensive and derogatory act of Black and brown face.
You're watching Let's Talk Racism. This episode is all about personal stories, experiences that average people have had with racism all over the world.
Systemic racism also occurs in Asian communities, as the coronavirus pandemic has stirred up hate against Asians, from its first case being linked to China.
Eunice Na is a Korean university student in Canada. She experienced a racist incident during the start of the pandemic while in line at a gas station. She spoke to our classmate, Hee-Jin Lee.
And after you hear from Eunice, you'll hear a similar experience from a student in the Netherlands, Jae-Chi Wong.
Xenophobia is defined as the fear and hatred of foreigners, and something the world has been witnessing or hearing about since the first known case of COVID-19. From racially stemmed slander, abuse, and attacks against the Asian community, xenophobia has played a prominent role in the chaos of the global pandemic, in which Canada is also found guilty. Eunice Na, a 20-year-old student from the University of Waterloo, shares her story on how she was treated at a Waterloo gas station because of her race.
I was the only person of color there, if I can remember correctly, but I was heading out when a man walks in, and he just kind of walks up to me and he says, like 17 people have died today because of COVID, where is your mask? And I remember like being kind of like, wow, that just happened, because this was when all these videos and stories of Asian people kind of being like persecuted with the coronavirus was like popping up on the internet. And I was just like, wow, like this is really happening. But I think the only thing I responded was with like, sir, where is your mask? And I like was not having it, so I just walked away. There were like a lot other closer people like to him, but instead he like targeted me and said that. Unfortunately, like I've had a lot of friends who like they're just walking down the street and like people will like yell like racial slurs and say like go back to Wuhan, or say like all these terrible things. And I think another thing is like my parents live in America, and like there was a time where I was like really worried, more so that rather than them contracting the virus, I was more worried that they would like feel the effects of like racism instead. So as an Asian person, it's like not only do I fear kind of just contracting the virus itself, but I also am definitely a lot more cognizant of just how much more apparent like the virus or the pandemic of racism is. So yeah, definitely not a safe time overall. Although we're speaking about like racism towards like Asians right now, or Asians in Canada, I also want to encourage like all of us, whether you are BIPOC or whether you are not, to kind of just self-reflect and see like all the racial biases that we have within ourselves too, because just as much as like Asians have been an object of racism, like I'm sure many of my like Asian brothers and sisters, like including myself, have been on the other side and have like said or done like not so great things as well. So hopefully, like as a community, we can do better, and we can really like understand like how we can do better with our privilege.
I feel I did say that I feel very like not appreciated, like not valued, like you're not worthy enough to be in the place where you are. When the coronavirus, like when the pandemic started, in the media, it was very big that it was like it was portrayed in a very big way that Chinese people are carrying the virus along with us, and it set us apart. It um alienated us more like that. Like we're like a different breed that carries this deadly virus. But when it comes to Asian racism, it's more about in a in a hilarious manner. It's more like a laughable manner, like we're a funny character or something like that.
Asian people all over the world experienced racist remarks and discrimination when the pandemic began. Unfortunately, a group of people in India with more East Asian features were also treated badly.
Northeast India shares over 90% of borders with other countries: Bangladesh, Bhutan, Burma, China, and Nepal.
People share a facial resemblance to East Asians. Due to the fact that they simply look different than the rest of India, they are often discriminated against. And it's actually gotten worse during COVID-19. Here's my classmate Akshat, who is presenting his story on the same.
Hakasngi Sunday, Hakapor Kumbashi Po Bujimin Miet, Ngalaya Lang Badi Parlok Lingba Kibenta Jonga Vijaynagar, Yakabandit Hitchur, Uwe Ubril, Ugorov Vora, Ulayat Lat Yat Stat Yagi Dakatok Tokum Uknam, Hadin Ba Ula Bia Yakadur Kamat Jonga, Barok away Daka Umbiakwai. But Kadbo Dang Yat Lat Kumta, Ngalayos Ngo Yakajing Pertakamen Kumbayo Jingjob Takabaong, Corona. Ngarang sngo si, but sngo benyao, ya ka jinglet jonga lingba kate kalinti, hakate kasngi. Kadaw pangalit banjat lingba kate kalinti kalong namar baro kidukan hakajaka sa jongi kikang. Rajibun kibrio kibayat hakata kalinti. Ngalay ipat ya we rang ba balap pedeng rata ba wan sha persha jong kapang jongi da ka thok thok. Kat ba kasengi ba berngut jong ukalanang kampau shai nga so thu ba udan ban le ne ban ong. Kabenta ka basno shirke kalong ba ka tempo kenthop ki duma kilalit rung ha ka khamat jonga ki khamat jonga kila sat pat khluit kum kading bat kila pen bitar shisayanga kipulet kila ai mukot duma hapo ka section sans pa khandai kata kajing peneranya kajing long buram jong ka kenthe. Wala ka jingja kalakta penmong ya ka jinglong burom jonga kum ka gante. Ka khamdai pat ka kam sneo bala penmi na ka jinge phe snow jat bendrem. Man sha khot corona la ne ban yoi ba ki brio ki ka no. Yala ki shintur habangi dei ban ya lingba. Kala kala long ka rukom menta.
Go Carona, 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 Carona, go Carona, go Carona, go Carona, go Carona, go go Carona, 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 go.
A similar thing happened in the Netherlands to a woman called Jaiji Xiong Yu. She noticed the racism happening in the beginning of COVID and was trying to work on it. Later, she was thrown a punch from someone on a scooter who yelled Chinese at her.
Our next story isn't about discrimination during COVID, but about day-to-day prejudice that ethnic minorities face in Hong Kong.
A recent survey found that more than 80% of ethnic minorities in Hong Kong say they face discrimination when using public facilities, including shopping and dining in restaurants.
Kunal Krishna Das is from India. He's a college student in Hong Kong. During his 3 years there, he has experienced racial discrimination, for example, in shops, restaurants, and at markets.
I remember when I came to Hong Kong for the first time, probably about like 3 years earlier, should be in 2017. So I went to a local restaurant with my friends. My friends, as in at that time I had friends who were Chinese and Western friends as well. So we went together to a restaurant, and then I could see the difference in attitude of the waiter towards me and my Western friends. So like for me, he just came and he dropped the menu, and then he took the order so quickly and he didn't ask me like what kind of drinks I wanted. He was in such a hurry and a kind of little bit rude. However, when he was taking order from my friends, because we were sitting in the same table, I could notice the difference. Like he was more composed, more calm, and he's more willing to be engaged with them.
Kunal's experience is not unique. According to a 2016 survey by the Equal Opportunity Commission, 82% of the respondents faced discrimination in the service industry. Based on how they are graded, people's willingness to help, tone of voice, eye contact, facial expression, and courtesy, ethnic minority customers gives a rating of 6 out of 10. But Caucasian and Chinese respondents give 7 and 8 points out of 10, respectively.
So it's not just about the way people tell me or something, it's not about what they say, but sometimes it's also about the gesture or the way they look at you that kind of makes you a little bit uncomfortable. I know there might be some like language barriers, talking stuff, there might be some barriers and gaps, but however, sometimes those gestures actually makes us feel a little bit uncomfortable.
Kunal would choose convenience stores and larger shops just to minimize having to interact with people working there.
Well, and also yes, I have my friends, like South Asian friends, who often don't want to engage in any form of communication with the shop assistant or the shop owners. So they would sometimes just prefer to go to a supermarket or somewhere where they don't have to talk to anyone, where they can get their things that they need without just talking or communicating with anyone.
And that experience of being discriminated against in public places happened to be the next person we're going to hear from. She moved to the Netherlands from Bulgaria.
I'm Damiana Gramatikova. I'm from Sofia, from Bulgaria, and I came here to study. Since the beginning, I felt discriminated a little bit, but I don't think it's towards Bulgarians or something. It's towards any people coming from abroad. They really discriminate you with the language, and also their culture is very different from ours. I felt discriminated mostly in shops and in government institutions. Mostly places where I needed help. They really didn't care about if I knew Dutch or no. For them, it's just like, okay, you live in the Netherlands, you have to speak Dutch. It's not our job to make you feel comfortable or whatever. I just think other countries think of the Netherlands as Amsterdam. So they think like, oh, really an open country. I just compare it to some other countries that I've been in, and it's very different. Finding a job here is very difficult, again, because of the language barrier. They really don't care about your way of things, and they don't really help you because for them this is something normal.
Some people escape racism in their home countries and find their way to our countries. Noor Sama is a 16-year-old girl living in Steen, a small town in the Netherlands. Noor has had quite a past and was born and raised in Syria.
She was raised as a Christian while most of the Syrian population has an Islamic religion. Noor had to grow up during the war in Syria. This made it unsafe for her family to stay in Syria, and they fled.
Noor says her family faced danger in Syria, but she learned to adapt to her new life. Here's her story.
Hoi, ik ben Noor. Hier woon ik samen met mijn familie. Kom gezellig mee.
In 2011, toen begon alles. Toen werd het langzamer onrustig. Dus gingen we naar het dorp van mijn moeder. Want daar was het veel veiliger. Mijn vader was gaan werken. Toen hij onderweg was naar ons, werd hij ontvoerd. Ik kan me nog steeds herinneren, want het was echt een slechte dag. Ik voelde me toen echt heel slecht. Ik moest super veel huilen. Toen kreeg mijn moeder opeens een telefoontje van: we hebben je man ontvoerd en je moet 5 miljoen lira betalen, anders wordt hij onthoofd. Dus wij waren helemaal in paniek. Maar uiteindelijk had mijn opa geld geregeld en had het gewoon aan hun gegeven. En toen mijn vader vrijkwam, toen had hij helemaal geen zin meer om in Syrië te blijven wonen. Ze zeiden dat het de reden was omdat wij katholiek waren en geen moslims. Dus mijn vader zei, ja, als ik om mijn geloof ontvoerd word, ja, dan is er geen toekomst meer in het land. Mijn vader besloot om naar Nederland te komen en was hij vanuit Libanon naar Turkije gegaan. En vanuit Turkije naar Griekenland met de boot. En dat was ook best een spannende dag of hij het zou overleven met de boot naar Griekenland. Want het is best gevaarlijk. En uiteindelijk had hij het overleefd. Alleen hij moest wel in het water zich laten zinken. Ja, zodat hij geholpen werd door de mensen in Griekenland. En daarna ging hij vanuit Griekenland met vliegtuig met een neppaspoort naar Nederland toe. En na een jaartje mochten wij ook komen. Ik vond het zeker moeilijk toen ik hier aankwam, want ik verstond de taal niet. De cultuur was helemaal anders. Om 6 uur was het helemaal dood hier. Terwijl het in Syrië meer met de buren was. Dat iedereen naar buiten ging, om 8 uur ging wandelen, alles. Hier was echt stil. En ik kon geen vrienden maken hier, want ja, ik beheerste de taal toen niet. Dus moest ik de hele tijd gewoon thuis blijven. Mijn ouders hoor je al meteen dat ze niet uit Nederland komen en dat ze dan bijvoorbeeld de mensen meteen... Of dan hebben ze geen zin meer om iets uit te leggen. Of dan gaan ze echt gewoon heel langzaam praten.
Noor moved from Syria to the Netherlands. Now we'll meet Katie, who moved in the opposite direction, from England to Israel.
My name is Katie. I am currently living in Jerusalem, which is where I was born and raised. A lot of the divide is because of the history of conflict. But I've noticed even living here that a big thing is the language gap and the culture gap, because both languages and both cultures are very different, and when you don't speak the same language as someone, it's easy, I think, to dehumanize them. But definitely a sense of, we don't really want you here, we're not going to have a lot of grace with you in your day-to-day life. The people that we encounter in the military are actually young people, because young Israelis have to serve in the military, and so there's a lot of a sense of like, these young soldiers will be incredibly rude. They don't see my life as being as valuable as someone else's. And that's very difficult, because I'm very proud of who I am. I'm proud of where I come from. So, yeah.
So there's lots of countries around the world where immigrants struggle to adapt and be accepted. What are some of the difficulties refugees face in Hong Kong?
So Hong Kong is by nature a population made up of refugees. So most of the Chinese families, they moved to Hong Kong during World War II. And then in 1970s, like there's a lot of Vietnamese refugees came to Hong Kong. And then it forced a change in screening process. And because of that, refugees who have been coming to Hong Kong since are subject to a very stringent selection process. And so they can end up waiting for years in limbo, not being allowed to work or go to school.
That's really difficult. It's like you're leaving one hard situation and going into another one. And what about in England?
Refugees and immigrants in general are seen as, you know, lazy and all sort of horrible stereotypes, but They deal with a lot of issues such as accessing proper healthcare, getting employed for lower paid jobs, etc. And an example that comes to mind is the Mercy Baguma case. A young Ugandan woman was living in Glasgow and she was forced out of work because her leave to remain document had expired, and which subsequently led to her death and leaving her one-year-old child starving. So this was just a horrible case to read, but it was a clear example of negligence on the Home Office and the government's part when it comes to immigrants and refugees in this country.
Stories like that are so eye-opening, but it also gives us the opportunity to maybe make certain changes now that we know what the problems are. And Prati, what about in India?
So there's actually a similar condition existing in the northeastern part of India, because there's a marginalized chunk of population which consists of the refugees and immigrants, and they are unfortunately ill-treated and most of the times neglected by the local and even the central government authorities.
Ethnic minority migrants in Hong Kong sometimes face difficulties finding accommodation.
Although real estate agents are supposed to follow certain guidelines, those who work with South Asian migrants says those rules are often ignored. Marina and I talked to Malik, who has been turned down for more than 30 times when he was looking for an apartment.
Papa is coming.
Malik Omar Zeman and his family moved to Hong Kong from Pakistan 6 years ago.
They live in a 350 square feet apartment in Yuen Long, one of the less expensive districts in Hong Kong.
They looked at about 50 apartments in more than a month before they finally got to rent this one.
I believe that 30-40 times we finalized the apartment and then agent told us the landlord is not willing to give you.
A survey in 2018 conducted by Hong Kong Unison and Hong Kong Refugee Ministry Group found that over 90% of the 140 ethnic minority respondents said they experienced discrimination when they're looking for a place to live. Malik contacted many agents and landlords. He also tried websites and social medias.
The agent clearly told us that the landlord is not willing to give apartment to ethnic minorities.
Some of the landlords demanded to see his employment record and tax information. And even then, most of them would say no. Hong Kong Unison is a charity for ethnic minorities. Stories like Malik's, they say, are all too common. The Zubin Foundation, an NGO that seeks opportunities for ethnic minorities, says Hong Kong people often have a negative impression of ethnic minorities.
They have like stereotypes about ethnic minorities having parties every night, or they would be very loud, they always cooked like smelly foods. So all this sort of comments that they have been receiving over the past years. But again, reminding you, this is the first impression that we get from phone calls.
The agent authority says, though, they have tried to educate estate agents and set guidelines to comply with the racial discrimination ordinance. But Hong Kong Unison says the agents often ignore the guidelines.
Because landlords know they don't want to rent to someone in that ethnicity, and they would just, try and make another demand asking for the passport, and sure enough, the person doesn't hold a Hong Kong SAR passport, and they use the excuse because they won't fall under the law, and they know it.
The Equal Opportunities Commission handles complaints about racial discrimination, but bringing a case to court is easier said than done.
We have seen agents very outrightly say, we don't rent to Pakistanis, go away. Very outrightly. A lot of times because they don't have enough evidence. Because from the EOC point of view, the complainant has to provide the evidence of racial discrimination. So this is actually a gap in the law.
This is Hong Kong's Tsim Sha Tsui district. There's a high concentration of South Asians here. Many of these families have been in Hong Kong for more than a century. Some of them moved here, for example, from India, when both places were under British rule. So they are Hong Kongers in every single way.
We are planning to publish a booklet and hoping that when ethnic minorities read the booklet and know their rights, then they know how to tackle the situation.
Although Malik had a tough time finding an apartment, his experience of living in Hong Kong has generally been positive. The Zubin Foundation wants the government itself to set as an example.
They should hire ethnic minority more, have them in public services so that people can see ethnic minority faces, and also to have them more on their promotional material, set a scene or set a sample of like an international city with different colors of faces.
Ethnic minority people in Hong Kong have more to do with socio-economic status rather than race.
In Hong Kong, the largest ethnic minorities here are Filipinos. Most of them came here to work as domestic helpers. They're in a lower socioeconomic status already, and on their day off, you'll normally see them with nowhere to go but to sit on streets. And many will look down at them, so they kind of face discrimination. So that discrimination has to do with socioeconomic status rather than race. Where there are impoverished districts where there are large concentrations of, say, Blacks or Southeast Asian migrants, some of the people from these races live in very expensive areas too.
We've met a lot of people from different countries in this episode of Let's Talk Racism. They've all got one thing in common. That is, everyone has faced racism, prejudice, and discrimination based on their ethnicity.
The last person we'll meet in this episode of Let's Talk Racism is a 20-year-old student, Kyra Carmen. When I met Kyra, she had helped me understand racism from her perspective.
Has to start within the Black community before it gets out there, because we don't stand like together the way that we should. Like, we came together for George Floyd and like the other instances, but in terms of without there being someone dying or getting shot, it's just not there. There's not really that proper community.
Yeah, I think Kyra was completely right with what she was saying, and I myself relate to her. To be an advocate, we have to be actively involved and to, you know, just make sure that it's a priority in our lives. How can you be an advocate or ask others to be allies, Anna?
I agree. Being an advocate starts by using your voice and lending an ear with the goal of creating change. In my opinion, I don't believe it's the responsibility to ask for allies should fall on the shoulders of those who are dealing with oppression, because we're so fortunate to be in a society that has access to so much information and even the sharing personal experiences, like through this Zoom call today. So it's the responsibility of those who wish to use their voice to stay informed, to do their research, and to seek opportunities to be involved.
It will always be an uncomfortable topic, but it's important for us to have these conversations to inform and educate others to move towards a direction of change.
We can actually use social media platforms like Instagram and Twitter, which seem to be very popular nowadays, for posting and sharing the right kind of information. It is best if we could also try to participate and initiate in the works of local NGOs for this good cause of erasing racism and discrimination from our societies.
What are your thoughts, Fatimata?
Well, you can also have those conversations right in your own home with like family members or relatives who are either unaware or don't understand these issues that people are going through.
You have been watching Let's Talk Racism, a series of shows created by students from all around the world.
We're joined again by Cameron Foster from Fresno, California. We've heard lots of personal stories in this show. Did any of them relate to your personal experiences or things they've witnessed?
Yeah, I feel like I related to a majority of the stories in the show, more specifically microaggressions. I feel like those are the most common types of racism I've dealt with. And I feel like even if I'm not from the same exact background as another person, I still feel like their story related to something that I've experienced or someone else that I know has experienced. So it was very much nice and wholesome to know that I wasn't alone in these experiences.
Yeah, Kutsai, I can relate to what you're talking about when it comes to microaggressions. I think now like the biggest way that as a society we can move on from microaggressions would be to be aware of how we inflict them and when we're receiving them. I think knowing is that first step to making better choices, and then for us to also speak up when we're in situations that are demeaning or uncomfortable.
I agree with everyone. I still go through it, the racial injustices every day.
just driving in my car. And what I'm doing to spread awareness is I'm using my social media platform as an outlet to repost stories, to add my experiences.
Yeah, I think social media has been such a tool when it comes to making change. We now have the opportunity to use our voice on platforms, whether it's creating a podcast or doing a Zoom show like this one, or even if it's on Twitter by reposting initiatives that are going on. Social media is now a way for us to be connected and be advocates online.
Absolutely true. And although I haven't had any personal experiences with racism, I've known a lot of friends who have fallen prey to discrimination based on their skin color.
And in Hong Kong, when it comes to ethnic minorities, there are a number of NGOs, such as the Hong Kong Unison and the Zubin Foundation, and also government departments like Equal Opportunities Commissions are trying to help these ethnic minorities. But there's the lack of awareness about ethnic minorities' rights. And because some of the ethnic minorities who come from South Asia, they do not know their rights, and then they do not know how to complain when they face discrimination based on their race. So I think there's a need to increase awareness raising about ethnic minority rights in Hong Kong.
I think this show also helps with raising awareness and shining a light on a really important topic as racism. And I think we could always improve and do better.
I couldn't agree more. It's been great taking part in the show.
Nice to meet all of you.
And to the audience, thank you for tuning in and watching us.